Hello and welcome to the 50th episode of India's World. Today we are going to discuss the political crisis in Bangladesh. The election for Bangladesh Parliament are to be held on January 5th, 2014. However, the main opposition party, the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, has decided to boycott the elections. It has taken to the streets in violent protests against the elections, demanding that they be conducted by a neutral, non-partisan government. The ruling Awami League has rejected the demand as unconstitutional. The Awami League itself had demanded a similar neutral caretaker government in 1996, boycotting the elections at that time to push for this demand. This time around, the Awami League amended the constitution, providing for an interim government during elections consisting only of elected members of parliament and headed by the incumbent prime minister. This follows a Supreme Court judgment which has held that a non-elected election time caretaker government was illegal and that Bangladesh must be ruled by elected representatives at all times. Meanwhile, following the judgment of the International Crimes Tribunal, a senior Jamaat-e-Islami leader, Abdul Qadir Mullah, has been hanged for collaborating with the Pakistan Army in 1971 and on charges of participating in rape and mass murder. This hanging has provoked the cadres of Jamaat-e-Islami and they have gone on a rampage, destroying public and private property and killing Awami League supporters. In short, the situation in Bangladesh has become extremely messy in the run-up to the elections. To analyze the situation in Bangladesh, I have with me three very distinguished guests. We have Ambassador Mukherjee. He was India's High Commissioner to Bangladesh, also High Commissioner to Nigeria. We have Mr. Rana Banerjee from the Indian Administrative Service. He retired as Special Secretary from Cabinet Secretariat, and he's an expert on security and intelligence related matters. And we have my old friend, Ambassador Pinak Ranjan Chakravarty, India's High Commissioner to Bangladesh and also Ambassador to Thailand, and knows the region well. So welcome all of you to this discussion. If I might begin with you, Ambassador Mukherjee, do you think the dialogue initiated by the US Assistant Secretary of State between the BNP and the Awami League might lead to the BNP actually participating in the elections, or do you think BNP will insist on boycott and Awami League will insist on not going back on the system of governance that it has put in place for elections?
Well, firstly, both sides would have to give a little somewhere in order to arrive at a conclusion which leads to an election where everybody can participate. But the situation, Bharat, is a little more complex than that. I mean, there are charges that the Awami League itself would not be unhappy to see the BNP out of the elections. And equally, the BNP may not be anxious to fight the elections at the moment while the war crimes trials are going on. So there are different strands which have come together to create this extremely awkward situation. But besides what the UN representative did, I think there have been people in both parties who are anxious to see that participative elections do take place. And if good sense prevails on both sides, it might still happen.
Mr. Banerjee, suppose this doesn't happen and BNP keeps out. So a party which enjoys 33 to 35% support amongst the masses is out of an election. A one-sided election is held. How credible would such an election be, and would the new government be able to sustain itself?
You're quite right. Any such election would lack credibility and international acceptance. But I think Ambassador Mukherjee has just summed up the situation so acutely. There may be a give and take. There is a process that is already going on. 4 rounds or 3 rounds have been held of talks between the two sides. Even I think 3 days back in the UN resident coordinator's presence, Neil Walker, Syed Ashraful Islam, who is the General Secretary of the Awami League and also a minister, met with Mirza Fakhrul Islam Alamgir of the BNP. And they did work out, or at least discuss each other's demands. I think the BNP leader, Khaleda Zia, would want to work for a situation where there is a sort of interim setup minus Sheikh Hasina. If Sheikh Hasina agrees to that, I think it could still work.
Pinak, if a compromise is worked out, do you think the election can be postponed beyond January 5th?
I think that is what they are demanding at the moment. And if a compromise is worked out, I think it can be, the elections can be postponed for a few days.
How do you do it legally?
Well, I think the government, the constitution has a particular time limit. I think it is January 24th, that there must be a new government or a new parliament in place. So there is a little bit of time, a couple of weeks, but not more than that. And I think that is the time frame that they have to work out some compromise. So they are working against a time limit imposed by the constitutional provisions. And I think there is a possibility, there is some meeting ground somewhere. So that domain is not closed. And if the major demand, like give and take, of course, as Ambassador Mukherjee said, has to be there for any compromise. And if Sheikh Hasina finally decides, if at all, to step aside and allow a government of elected leaders to participate, and maybe BNP could also join that government, and because she has offered that BNP could also nominate some of its MPs into this government. So I think that is a possible solution.
Okay, Ambassador Mukherjee, a lot of Awami League functionaries say, and you hinted at it earlier, that even if BNP doesn't participate, and if the participation rate of ordinary voters is more than 50%, they say 51%. If 51% of the voters vote, BNP keeps out, they're saying it will still be a legitimate election. Do you agree with this?
Well, what is being intended at the moment is within the four corners of the Constitution. Now, how many people come out to vote, that's a matter that is to be seen. Obviously, more than 50% does make it appear credible. But I think, as was said by Mr. Banerjee, I think that if you have a major party not participating, I'm not sure how long such a government can function as a government should function, and what kind of international recognition that would get. You see, sometimes politics goes beyond the Constitution, and I think this is one of those cases.
Mr. Banerjee, do you agree with the opinion polls that have come out in Bangladeshi newspapers that Awami League has lost support, and if there was a free and fair election, the BNP would sweep?
I wouldn't be so sure. Of course, the Awami League will suffer from anti-incumbency, but there are several factors which are going for them, particularly the support for the trials, the international, trial for the war criminals. This is something where there is mass support among students who are not, the Shahbag, group are not entirely Awami League. They are across a wider cross-section. The Jatiya Samajtantrik Dal is there. Then very many non-party people, youngsters, also feel very strongly about this point.
Okay, all right. We need to take a break at this point. We'll be back in a bit. Don't go away. Welcome back. We're discussing the political crisis in Bangladesh in the run-up to the general election. Mr. Mukherjee wanted to add something to what Mr. Banerjee was saying.
Comment. As I had said at the outset, there are various issues which have become intermixed. And taking off from what Mr. Banerjee said, you see, we are getting into a situation where there are very large numbers of people, including from within the BNP, who are fully supportive of the trials that are going on. And yet the BNP, unfortunately, I think, has found itself, frankly, tied to Jamaat's coattails.
Yeah, we're going to discuss that in greater detail in a minute.
To come back to it for just a moment. So you have a situation where the BNP, senior members of the leadership, are seen to be pro-Jamaat and pro the war criminals, whereas the Awami League may have distanced itself from many people, but a very large number of people are supportive of what the Awami League has been doing.
All right. Pinak, what impact would the hanging of Abdul Qadir Mullah have on the elections? Because it will lead to, and has already led to, increased violence.
I think the violence will continue. The Jamaat Shibir cadres will certainly try to exact revenge. And I wouldn't be surprised if one or two other Jamaat leaders are hanged in the next month or so. I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, I don't know whether it will happen. So that will lead to bloodshed, violence that is already happening. Add that to the BNP's, strikes and hartals that are happening. So there will be, in the next few weeks and months, will be a lot of chaos in Bangladesh.
The situation will get worse.
Situation is likely to remain very, very volatile.
Okay. Mr. Banerjee, what would be the role of the Jatiya Party? because H.M. Irshad till a month ago was an ally of Awami League. Then he said he's going to sit in the opposition, and there was a hope that there would be an election where, the legitimate parliamentary opposition would be led by Irshad. Then he went back on that. Now he's been confined to a military hospital, and there's talk of some approaches being made to his wife, Roshan Irshad, who's a minister in the interim government, to become acting chairman. So do you think the question of Jatiya Party participating or not participating in the elections is not yet settled?
Well, yes, that's a difficult one to call, but Irshad historically has been a quintessential sort of fence-sitter, and at the same time he's a very astute observer of the political pulse. So the problem is that his own party is a little bit faction-ridden, and part of his party, led by his wife, the faction is still with the government. They're fond of the loaves and fishes of office. There is another faction which is closer to the, old erstwhile Bangladeshi left. So it's an odd mix. Irshad has had a certain charisma, but he's become very old now. And we don't know the exact nature of his illness. Perhaps it is only a political sort of illness. But what happens eventually is a difficult one to call.
Okay. Ambassador Dev Mukherjee, you said something about the BNP Jamaat ties earlier. Now, BNP, from what one can see, is really a conglomeration of interests. It doesn't have a cadre base like the Jamaat does. So when there are street protests, it gets increasingly dependent on the Shibir and the Jamaat. Shibir is the student wing of Jamaat.
Correct.
So as this dependence increases, is there a danger that the BNP's political leadership, the people, the persons will be the same, but the agenda will be determined increasingly by the radical Islamists?
I think there is a very severe danger of this happening. We saw bits of it during the last government of the BNP Jamaat coalition, when in fact many people in India thought that Bangladesh had become another Afghanistan. I mean, there were talk of the radicalization of Bangladesh. And let us remember that happened during the BNP Jamaat combine. If a similar combine comes in the future, unless there is a very serious introspection by the BNP in the interests of Bangladesh, I think there is a great danger of what you are suggesting.
Okay. Pinak, there's another group that has come up recently, that is Hefazet-e-Islam. Now, Hefazet, a lot of people say, was really the creation of Awami League initially to take on the Jamaat. But you had a situation during the Shahbag movement when Hefazet brought thousands of people out in the streets because some blogger had apparently criticized Islam and the Prophet. And there was firing on them, and a lot of them died. Now, the Hefazet says it's a non-political organization. But after that firing, do you think individually, not organizationally, individually, a lot of Hefazet imams and members would have turned against the Awami League?
That's possible, but don't also forget that the Jamaat-e-Islami is not the only Islamist party in Bangladesh. There are other Islamic groups who are also very anti-Jamaat. In fact, there are groups which are, aligned with the Awami League against Jamaat and other such parties, and the BNP. The Awami League itself also is not beyond a bit of dalliance with the Islamist parties. It has had under its umbrella and the Mahajot Islamist parties as well.
But it had an alliance with the Jamaat-e-Islami in 1996.
Indeed, that is what I was coming to, that they have actually sat together in an alliance or in a virtual alliance earlier. But the Hefazet basically was motivated by couple of considerations. One is, of course, that they were instigated perhaps by the Awami League, and secondly by the Islamist, the argument that some blogger had, said something against the Prophet. Now, these are issues that are yet to play out. I mean, Hefazet-e-Islam is basically cadres from the madrasas and the mosques, etc. Deobandis, yes, and they are also from the not the mainstream nationalized madrasas, but from the private madrasas, which are funded, and I need not go into where their funding comes from, because don't forget that the Jamaat and its cadres are very well funded, and they have economic institutions. They have built many economic institutions which include hospitals.
My question really is, will Hefazet become political?
The Hefazet may or may not become political, because it is not clear whether they will actually become a party. It might, if the Jamaat and Hefazet get together, and then the agenda of Hefazet will become the Jamaat.
Okay. Mr. Banerjee, what are the prospects of the Bangladesh army intervening if the situation gets out of hand?
Well, what is different today in Bangladesh army is that, they are no longer looking at the Jamaat as, their second string. In the past, this used to be the tradition from Pakistan, which had been inherited. But over the last, say, 10 years or so, the Bangladesh army and the police, they seem to have been disillusioned by this type of support to the Jamaat and the activities in the larger umbrella of, Islamic terror, which was, which surged a lot in the period 2002 to 2006, and there were crackdowns against these groups. Also the revolt in the Bangladesh Rifles, there again they seem to have been taken by surprise by this whole development, and possibly may have decided to distance themselves from any Islamic revivalist elements.
Okay. All right, we need to take a break again at this point. We'll be back again after the break. Don't go away. Welcome back. We are discussing the political crisis in Bangladesh in the run-up to the general election. Ambassador Mukherjee, has the Bangladesh army become the biggest votary of democracy also because of its exposure to UN peacekeeping missions, and they know that if they become a rogue army, conduct a coup, they lose a lucrative source of income?
Well, you are right, of course, and last time the army had to take over, the army was going to be used by the BNP for holding the elections in 2007. The army had been cautioned by the European Union and the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon himself, that if you step out of line and if you go against the people for holding illegitimate elections, then you should beware of losing all the UN posts. So this is partially correct. But I think, to be fair to the Bangladesh army, I think they conducted themselves admirably in the 2 years that they were in power, and they held elections that were absolutely free and fair. And sometimes, when we speak of the Bangladesh army, we get confused with the Pakistan army, which has a different history, which has different motivations. The Bangladesh army, I think, is very happy where it is, and I think they are a force for the nation and not against the nation.
Okay. Mr. Banerjee, do you think that there will be further violence because against the minorities, especially Hindus? Because each time the BNP, Awami League and Jamaat-e-Islami or the government, there's a clash between them, for some reason it's the Hindus who get massacred.
Yes, that is always possible. I mean, particularly if the Jamaat movement, which has acquired a certain momentum, and politically now if the BNP comes to power, then the Jamaat would definitely be emboldened to once again.
No, even now during this course of violence.
Even now it's a hazard. It's a hazard which the Hindus will have to live with there, and one can't be sure. There are pockets of Hindu minorities, substantial strength and if the momentum of agitation by the Shibir is there, it's always possible.
Okay, just to change the track, do you think India has a role, Pinak, in helping in rapprochement between the BNP and the Awami League?
I think our role will be very, very limited in the sense that because the BNP sees India as having very good and close relations with the Awami League historically, and the BNP has not been that friendly to India in the past. So I think it will be difficult for India to mediate here, because immediately India will be suspected of some ulterior motive because of the strong connection with the Awami League.
But when the BNP leader Begum Khalida Zia came to Delhi, she had extremely sort of friendly talks with India and gave assurances about Bangladeshi territory not being used or would not be allowed to be used against any of Bangladesh's neighbors.
There is a certain ambivalence in the BNP, and it has been there always. I mean, don't also forget that when Prime Minister Vajpayee visited in 1999, Khaleda Zia, for some very dodgy reason, refused to see him.
Where she refused to see President Pranab Mukherjee.
Indeed, and she repeated the same maneuver when President Mukherjee visited. So there is a certain degree of ambivalence. When out of power, she reaches out to India, but when in power, she behaves differently.
Okay, Master Mukherjee, why is there an impression, despite what Pinak is saying, there is an impression in Bangladesh that India this time is openly backing the Awami League?
I cannot really comment on that impression, Bharat, because referring to Begum Khaleda Zia's visit to Delhi, I mean, she was extended courtesies which went far, far beyond what is extended to leaders of the opposition. There is a historical affinity between the Awami League and India. And let us also note that whereas in the BNP regimes in Bangladesh, Indian separatists have been actively supported, sometimes with ISI connivance, and this is public knowledge. The Awami League in the past 5 years has, I think, addressed all our security concerns. And I think this is something which India should appreciate. And it is up to the BNP to live up to the assurances which, as Pinak said, is held out when they are out of power.
But Mr. Banerjee, the underlying theme is that we should, here is Awami League which has delivered, and here is BNP which is only giving you these verbal checks. But I am saying that if the BNP is willing to change, why should India not believe it?
Yeah, well, the believing would lie in seeing the action on the ground, which has not happened, unfortunately. In the past also,
but they have not come back into power since then.
No, but when in the past they were in power, many of the assurances which were held out were just not fulfilled. Yeah. And Paresh Barua, of course, now he is on the run a little bit, but all the others continued to remain there, and on one pretext or the other, the Ulfa people who were in jail in Bangladesh were not handed over. Since then, there has been much movement in this regard.
Why is there an impression that India does not have a long-term policy in Bangladesh, that it takes sides? And is that a good long-term policy to have? Or should we deal with any government that comes into power and not favor any political party? Because we should have learned this from our experience in other neighboring countries where we've done a similar thing.
I think by and large we have followed a policy of dealing with the government in power, a legitimate government in power, and even if it is not so legitimate, I think we have dealt with those governments because that has been our policy. Now, if one government we have better relations and with another government we do not have as good relations, that is not really fault of Indian policy. I think you have to look at the other end also. It's never a one-way street. And we'll be happy to work with any government that comes to power in a free and fair election legitimately. But we'll also have to work with a government that is in place, which is a fait accompli. And that is what we did when, for example, the caretaker government backed by the army came to power in 2007.
Okay. Last question to you, Master Mukherjee. The US has been very active in Bangladesh in trying to bring about a rapprochement. The UN has been very active. My question to you is, are we on the same page? Is the US, UN and India on the same page in Bangladesh, or do we have differing perspectives?
I don't know what is happening in dark corridors, but my impression is that we may not be on the same page. I mean, if I look at John Kerry's advice to Prime Minister Hasina that this gentleman, Qadir Mullah, should not be hanged, I mean, it resonates the 1971 policies of the United States when they backed these war criminals under his distinguished predecessor. So there is in the US, or at least influential sections of US policy making, which seem tied down to certain old ideas. And may I tangentially make a point here? You see, traditionally the BNP or the Jatiyo Party, their members speak far better English. They dress better, they can hold a glass of wine. The Awami League, by and large, come from the people. And that for Western diplomats is not always very clear. as to the communications are concerned.
Okay, all right. We've run out of time. So thank you very much for all of you for coming here and discussing the Bangladesh situation with us. Let's hope the situation in Bangladesh stabilizes and there is a participatory, inclusive election. That's all we have for you today. We'll be back again next week with another interesting issue. Till then, goodbye.